Volume 7. Prologue. In the very heart of the great tomb of Nazarick, deep within the 10th floor, the throne room adorned with 40 flags simmered with excitement. Everyone there had formed ranks while silently bowing their heads toward the throne in a display of their loyalty. Grotesques filled the rows. Needless to say, the floor guardians were also present. Other NPCs, created by the 41 Supreme Beings and the minions who reported directly to the Guardians, were also in attendance. There were easily over 200 total present at the first gathering this large since the day they had arrived in their current world. One thing, however, was different from previous times. This wasn't the usual lineup. The audience was packed to the brim with powerful beings. The average level in the room was over 80. Shaltir, guardian of the first 3 floors of Nazarick, usually had her vampire brides at her side, but today she had summoned her most elite undead followers. Then there was Mare, one of the 2 guardians on the 6th floor, who was accompanied by a pair of dragons that had never left their posts until now. These dragons were almost level 90 and could only be obtained as a super rare drop from loot boxes. Even among the carefully selected minions, one group stood out. In comparison to everyone else, this group of undead was more than slightly inferior. There were around 100 of them, the highest level among them only 40, lined up alongside the other 200 beings in the chamber. The regular denizens formed rows facing the throne, but the out-of-place undead, which were the least impressive of those invited to this sacred place, were arranged in lines near the very front, right beside the guardians themselves. They stood shockingly close to the throne, indicating higher status. It was unthinkably favorable treatment, but there was a good reason for this. Those creatures had been created by the ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, Ainz Ooal Gown himself. It would be a mistake to neglect them. All of those present were Ainz's subordinates. They devoted themselves completely to the guild Ainz Ooal Gown, but at the same time, there was a clear hierarchy of superiors and inferiors. Naturally, NPCs personally created by the 41 Supreme Beings were at the very top. Among those, the guardians of each level stood highest. After these NPCs, the next in rank were the auto-spawning monsters, plus those created by the Yggdrasil mercenary system, minions. To an extent, the standing of minions depended on their strength and their responsibilities, but the majority of them were lined up side by side with no differentiation. So where did the undead created by Ainz fit in? This question was a tricky one for Albedo, captain of the Guardians. She wondered if they should be considered equal to the NPCs. When she consulted Ainz, he broke into a smile and declared that the lowest position was fine. Ainz's undead creation ability could only be used a limited number of times per day, but it had no cost. The high-level minions that the Guardians brought with them, however, had been created with gold coins or real cash through the game Yggdrasil's mercenary system. If the undead minions died, they could be created for free, but if the high-level minions died, the money invested in them went up in smoke. In Ainz's view, although they still required a corpse, the free monsters he created were clearly inferior to anything that cost money. But his loyal subordinates did not share this view. Though moved to tears by their magnanimous master's decision, Albedo was unable to accept it. In distress, she sidestepped the issue by making an exception and lining the minions up one behind the other. Ainz looked down from the room's highest point over the ranks that Albedo had racked her brains to organize and spoke quietly like an oracle. No, to all the beings under his influence, his words were nothing less than those of a god. First, I'd like to thank you for your extended service gathering intelligence, Seabass, and solution. Well done. Ainz nodded in satisfaction when the pair below bowed deeply. But the hard part came next. Behaving like a king was too much for an ordinary person to handle. The pressure was staggering. Below him stood a sea of subordinates. Love and respect sparkled in their eyes. The stomach Ainz didn't even have began to ache while his equally non-existent heart pounded. But that only lasted a moment. The intense desire he felt to flee was forcibly dispelled by a particular characteristic of his undead body, which suppressed emotional fluctuations. After finally concluding he could perform his role as ruler to satisfaction, Ainz started giving out orders. "Both of you, come before me." The two who had been mentioned rose together. With such synchronized movements, anyone would think the event had been rehearsed. They climbed the stairs to the throne and halted before Albedo, who stood adjacent to Ainz. They kneeled in unison. "Raise your heads. In recognition of your excellent work, I'm going to reward you." Ainz looked at Seabass. "Seabass, you begged for Tswear's life, but the reason I put her under my protection was to pay back a debt. It had nothing to do with your service. Therefore, I'll grant you a wish. Now then, tell me what you'd like." Praising someone in public could rouse the onlookers to action. That was the general aim of giving the president's award out in front of the entire company. Subordinates motivated by rewards improved the overall efficiency of the organization. That was why Ainz had utilized his experience as a working adult and gathered so many of his people here, to create an opportunity to inspire that zeal. But there was also an extremely dangerous side to this plan, because Ainz had to exude the charisma of a ruler in front of a massive amount of people. That was no easy feat for an ordinary person. Still, as the last player left in the Great Tomb of Nazarick, it was a mission he needed to clear. "I have to live up to their devotion." As Ainz steeled his will, Seabass's mustache quivered. "My wish is to devote myself completely to, these guys are insanely loyal. That's why I'm under so much pressure." "Good, but I'm rewarding you for a job well done." That's something a ruler should do. Know that there are times when a follower's lack of selfishness can displease their master. "My lord, I beg your pardon." In that case, Seabass thought for several seconds and then spoke. "By way of your benevolence, I would like clothing and necessities for Tswear, my ward." For clothes, I could take something out of my private collection, but, during his Yggdrasil days, since there wasn't much chance of coming across limited edition items or player-made skins more than once, he always snapped up any appearance-related goods that caught his interest even a little bit with no hesitation. And it wasn't just Ainz. All his friends tended to do the same. No, it was likely that any player would do the same thing. Ainz's guildmate, the man who created Shaltir, Pero Roncino, called it the phenomenon of obtaining something even if you aren't sure you'll use it or not, just like you do with sexy pics. He continued, "Well, most of the time you forget about it and it lies dormant in a folder somewhere, but..." And that was exactly what happened. Ainz had collected men's and women's gear alike, but most of it was in storage and had never been used. It was all going to waste fertilizing his wardrobe. Finding something to do with it would be much smarter. Ainz considered all the garments he'd amassed. Clothes in Yggdrasil were often a bit gaudy, but he figured there had to be something perfect for Tswear in there somewhere. "No, you don't have to do that. You've already been so kind to Tswear. I think anything more would be too much." "I see. That's fine, then." But clothes, for Ainz, who had never bought women's clothing before, it was too difficult a job. What if I pick it and she thinks I have bad taste? His ratings among the female populace of Nazarick would probably plummet. "Do you mind if I ask Narbril to do the shopping?" It wouldn't do to trouble the ruler of the Great Tomb of Nazarick. It wasn't as if Seabass had read Ainz's thoughts, but his offer came with perfect timing. "Narbril, you don't mind, do you?" In response, one of the NPCs standing at attention below bowed deeply. "That's fine, then, Seabass. I'll leave it up to Narbril." Or, he grinned. His face didn't move, of course, but he meant to be grinning. You could accompany Tswear as a date. He'd heard about the pair's relationship from the head maid. Apparently, they hadn't gotten physical yet, but Demiurge was also saying that it was only a matter of time. Demiurge. Why was he mentioning it would be a good thing for Seabass and Tswear to have sex? Well, he was probably just celebrating that his colleague got a girlfriend. In that sense, when you think about it, they're getting along pretty well after all. Things were a bit tense in the kingdom, but maybe it was just due to the circumstances. Well, I'm somewhat relieved. Their creators were always fighting, but I never got too involved. The root of Touch Me and Ulbert's quarrel lay outside Yggdrasil, which was to say in the real world, Ulbert was jealous. The trouble started after that one fight. That must have triggered it all. Realizing that now, Ainz felt like he was gazing out over a desert wasteland, but at the sound of Seabass's somewhat surprised voice, he cleared those thoughts from his mind. "That's all right with you, my lord? If so, then I'd like to take Swear shopping. I'm not the type to pick on a happy couple just because I'm single." With the silly thought of putting on the jealousy mask and tailing them if they went on a date in Irantal, he said, "I don't mind," and gestured with his chin at the other person bowed before him. Then, "Solution, tell me your wish." "I would love a few humans, live ones, if it's not too much trouble. Nothing would delight me more than if they were also pure." Ainz thought of the humans they had captured. Most of those still alive were members of the Eight Fingers, in other words, people who had caused him some displeasure. He'd received a report that the ones who seemed useful had been tortured until their spirits were broken. The only others were exceptions under the protection of a pair who were currently in disciplinary confinement. "I can't use those. Pestonia and Nigredo went so far as to defy my word to protect them." "Okay. I'll give you a few live humans. Just not pure ones. Forgive me for being unable to fulfill all your requests." "Nonsense. It was not my place to request purity. I am overjoyed to receive live ones." In response to Solution's deep bow, Ainz nodded in a manner he thought appropriate for a ruler. "I see. Then thank you. Very well, the two of you are dismissed. Entoma, come to me." Entoma traded places with the other two and kneeled. "Now then, Entoma." "My lord." Her voice was difficult to understand and Ainz winced. "So your voice hasn't returned to normal yet?" The lip bug Entoma equipped wasn't a monster that autospawned in Nazarick, but that didn't mean they didn't have any. If she used one of the several in her room that had been summoned with Yggdrasil coins, she could go back to her base voice at any time. There was only one reason she wouldn't, a grudge. "Is it grating to your ears? I'll go put on my voice immediately." "No, not at all. I don't have anything against this voice, you know." "Thank you. You worked hard enough to find yourself in this state, but not quite enough to warrant a reward. I cannot grant you as much as I did the other two, but is there something you would like?" Ainz felt that giving out rewards left and right indicated indiscretion, not generosity. A surplus of anything decreased its value. In that sense, according to Ainz standards, Entoma's efforts were insufficient for a bonus. Still, sending her away with nothing after she sustained such a serious injury would be unkind. "What's that thing called? A Purple Heart? I don't know much about army stuff." If he were here, he could tell me all about it. Ainz recalled a guild member who was a military otaku. "Then, Lord Ainz, please let me know if there is an opportunity to kill that little girl. I want to steal her voice." Realizing she meant the mysterious girl with the mask, evil eye, Ainz granted his permission. "Very well. I'll let you know. You're dismissed, Entoma." He watched her return to her previous position. Okay, moving on. Naturally, there were no objections. But Ainz couldn't necessarily be happy about that. It was quiet because these were people who regarded him as an absolute, who believed that a single word from him could turn white into black. The silence in no way implied he was doing the right thing. "I should probably establish an inspection agency and a bunch of others." First, he wanted to create a position that would be in charge of conferring honors. The problem was that the NPCs and minions thought devoting themselves to Ainz was only natural, and like Seabass, all of them considered uncompensated service the norm. Another issue was that since the standards of assessment were vague, Ainz was simply deciding performance based on his own values. "If we want to do these things on a bureaucratic level, they'll need to clarified. I suppose this is what I get for heaping all the management of the organization onto Albedo and running away. But this is too much for one ordinary person to handle. I can barely use any of my life experience. Satoru Suzuki, who had always been on the receiving end of work honors, felt like he could truly sympathize with the pain of people who had to hand them out, then frantically suppressed the thought. He could think over things when he was rolling around alone on the pleasant-smelling bed back in his room. We're going to decide on a plan for Nazarick. Demiurge, to me. The wisest being in Nazarick ascended the stairs and stood across from Albedo. Captain of the Guardians, Albedo. Most wise, Demiurge. I believe our original plans are mostly accomplished. I would like to hear your thoughts on what Nazarick's course should be going forward. I also permit anyone else with suggestions to raise their hand. Ainz's highest priority was the continued existence of Nazarick. No, in the worst case, it would be fine to lose the location as long as he could ensure the safety of his guildmates' children, the NPCs. With their evacuation shelter set up and various other preparations, it would probably be okay. His second highest priority was to spread the name of Ainz Ooal Gown throughout the world. The reasoning was based on the optimistic idea that if any of his fellow guild members caught wind of it, they would come to him. He wondered if it would be all right to put this item farther down the list. The third highest priority was fortifying Nazarick. Ainz had a feeling that this one should actually be at the top. It was true that based on his observations, he had gotten the sense that Ainz Ooal Gown was the most powerful organization in a world where the Great Tomb of Nazarick was a mighty, impregnable fortress. Still, the enemy who had mind-controlled Shaltir was out there. Even if they were only able to accomplish that with a world item, it was dangerous to get complacent. And if world items existed, it wouldn't be a bad move for Nazarick to conduct itself as if other guilds existed. That was precisely why he felt the distinct need to strengthen their home base. At the moment, they were in the process of incorporating lizard men into their organization, while Ainz was continuously creating more undead, but he also thought their efforts needed to be more earnest. Priority number 4 was collecting information. It was previously seen as the most important but had been downgraded since they had accomplished it to some degree. That was the order of operations Ainz had in mind, but in the end, it was an ordinary person's take on things. His plan wasn't based on properly analyzed data, so there could have been holes in it. That was why Ainz wanted to borrow the wisdom of this pair of intelligent guardians. But if all he wanted was a consultation, he could have summoned just the two of them. Considering how dangerous it would be if they discovered how average Ainz truly was on the inside, it probably wasn't ideal to have the discussion in the current setting. But actually, that wasn't true. In fact, he needed to do things this way in order to fulfill his role of master in the manner that the NPCs imagined. In other words, he needed to be an absolute, unimaginably powerful sage. Both of you, speak clearly so everyone can hear. Those present are elites, you guardians personally selected. They should all listen to every word of our plan going forward with their own ears. Yes. This was Ainz's desperate move, a larger-scale version of his explain it to all the guardians tactic. It was his strategy to have everything spelled out for him while pretending he already understood under the pretense that someone else did not know yet or that he was requesting a simple explanation everyone could understand. Okay, Demiurge. Since some of those present are not aware of all the details, please give a simple rundown about the current situation and what we've done to the kingdom. Understood. Demiurge addressed the NPCs at the bottom of the stairs. I've been wanting to hear this. Of course, during the latest operation, Ainz had been convinced that the wise Demiurge couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong, but when he really thought about it, he felt like things might be going further than was absolutely necessary. Firstly, the highest echelons of the kingdom's underworld are now under our control, thanks to the efforts of Mare, Neuronist, and the Prince of Fear. If we continue to gradually infiltrate, we should be able to conquer it completely. And then? Ainz made a small noise. The question of why they were conquering the kingdom's underworld had escaped his lips. He felt like the brief explanation he'd been given before differed somehow. I guess having a permanent source of cash or easier access to information would be valid reasons? As he was thinking that, Demiurge, who had closed his mouth, whirled around to look right at him. Thankful his body couldn't sweat, Ainz asked, "What is it, Demiurge?" "I just thought I heard you say something, Lord Ainz, sorry. I meant to murmur my agreement, but I guess it was unclear." "Now, go on. Tell everyone the purpose of conquering the kingdom's underworld." "Yes, sir." "Well, everyone ruling the kingdom's underworld can be considered a foothold toward Lord Ainz's primary goal of world domination. I assume no one here is so feeble-minded that they fail to grasp this." All the faces Ainz looked down upon shone with comprehension. It didn't seem like there was a single person left in the dark. Ainz was the only one who didn't understand. World domination? What are you talking about? How long have you all been laboring under that assumption, were all things he obviously couldn't ask. Ainz felt the gears of his brain spin faster than they ever had in his entire life as he considered various angles for a few moments. This is utterly strange. I don't get it. How did this happen? Originally, he had wanted to work quietly to build a reputation without going around making enemies and hopefully contact any of his guildmates who may or may not have been in this world. That was his small, precious wish. But now, world domination? Where the hell did that come from? He wanted to deny it, but he didn't have the courage to speak up. Each and every minion, not to mention the NPCs, had a satisfied expression that seemed to say naturally, as if they were being told something they already knew. One glance was enough to tell that this was a fact that had long passed into common knowledge among everyone assembled. It was like a dry, lonely wind was whistling past the area around the throne. Ainz Ooal Gown was the absolute ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick and a supreme being. That's how his image had been built up, so what would happen now if he destroyed it? He would be like a pop star exposed by the paparazzi. A celebrity whose fans and profits dwindled would wind up in a sorry state, but he had the feeling his own fate would be far more tragic. It seems like we've poured too many assets into this to pull back now. Actually, when he took a moment to think about it, world domination didn't sound so bad. Of course, it wouldn't be as simple as a video game, but because an ordinary person like Ainz found it so absurd, it likely wasn't concrete enough for him to wrap his head around. But he did realize it would be the perfect way to reach his goal of gaining a reputation, even if it was a bad one. The only problem would be the opinions of his guildmates if they found out. He would just have to apologize honestly for not being able to control Nazarick. There's that unknown enemy who brainwashed Shaltir. Maybe I can use that as an excuse. They would forgive me, right? Having made up his mind, Ainz nodded benevolently at Demiurge, who looked like he was hoping for praise. You remembered? Of course, Lord Ainz. I could never forget a single word you've said. I see. So that conversation from back then, indeed, my lord. It was that conversation, right? Indeed, my lord. So it was that time. Well, I'm glad, Demiurge. Thank you. But you know, world domination is a difficult thing. It certainly is. So, how do you think we should go about it? Pretty impressive how my voice isn't shaking, if I do say so myself. I suggest we set world domination as our guiding principle going forward. It is my belief that Nazarick should act openly. With the ones who mind-controlled Shaltir currently operating in secret, it could be problematic for us to remain lurking in the shadows. I see, really? Lurking in the shadows seemed safer. Ainz had no clue how Demiurge had arrived at his conclusion. I agree, Lord Ainz. If we get the organization out in the open, then we can deal with issues openly as well. We wouldn't be limited to dispatching handfuls of agents or needing to creep around for investigations anymore. Hearing Albedo's explanation, Ainz finally understood. I see. It was tempting to go from these painstaking operations to simply doing whatever they wanted. So we rule the kingdom from behind the scenes, forcing them to acknowledge Nazarick. But I won't stand for this place you rule to be counted as part of the domain of some country, so, Demiurge shook his head in response to Albedo's concern. Of course you wouldn't, Albedo. Neither would I. Besides, I have analyzed and considered the data we collected, and there is practically nothing appealing about the kingdom, with the exception of one person. It's the same for the other countries. I think serving another state would be a foolish plan. Why is that? Serving another state would hold us back in some ways. If the ones who mind-controlled Shaltir hailed from some organization while we had been serving some state, we might not have been able to act in time. Therefore, Lord Ainz, Demiurge fixed his eyes on Ainz and solemnly made his suggestion. I propose we establish a country called the Great Tomb of Nazarick. End of prologue. If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Death. Imperial capital Arwinthal was a ways to the west in the Baharuth Empire's territory. At its center stood the imperial castle where Jerknavrun Farlord El Nix resided, while important facilities of every sort, the graduate school, the Empire's magic academy, government agencies, radiated out from it. The city was truly the heart of the Empire. Its population was smaller than the Riestai's kingdom's capital, but the scale was much grander. Additionally, due to major reforms over the past several years, the city was in the middle of the greatest growth period in its history. The capital was constantly importing new things, creating an influx of materials and talent, while the old and stagnant parts were demolished. The hope for the future that the residents carried was evident in their cheerful and bright expressions. The city practically clamored with dizzying excitement as Ainz walked through it with Narberl. Usually, people who had just arrived from the countryside would move slowly and take in their surroundings as they strolled, many of them struck by the many differences between the kingdom and the Empire. But Ainz didn't have that kind of time. His mental state was clearly reflected in his hurried gait. The emotion controlling him was displeasure. Demiurge's plan was the reason for Ainz's trip to the imperial capital, and every time it came to mind, the furrows in his brow grew deeper, though his face was only a magical illusion. Patience should have been unnecessary for the absolute ruler of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, Ainz Ooal Gown. Nor should there have been any need for him to suppress his irritation. For an overlord whose word was absolute, a being who could take something white, call it black, and have it be so, there shouldn't have been a single thing that didn't go his way. So why was he in this situation? Even though he wanted to veto Demiurge's proposal, there was a reason he hadn't been able to. In terms of putting the power of Nazarick on display, Demiurge's plan was extremely straightforward and would yield immediate results. The reason Ainz didn't like it despite that was because he felt it would bring dishonor on the creations of his friends. Rejecting a wonderful plan for personal reasons would be deplorable, and he certainly didn't want anyone to think he lacked the broad-mindedness to consider it. Besides, he hadn't been able to come up with a counterproposal. In the end, objecting without a counterproposal is just one form of whining. It was member of adult society Ainz, not supreme ruler Ainz, who shouted this in his head. Ainz repeated what he'd already told himself any number of times. Calm down. You need to chill. If you need to choose between logic and emotions, the correct choice for a boss is obviously logic. Guys who act based on emotions achieve amazing results if they're lucky, but most of the time they come up with nothing worth mentioning. Besides, the die is cast, I guess. Ainz didn't have any lungs, but he took a deep breath and exhaled. The citizens giving dubious looks to the warrior who suddenly started breathing heavily in the street didn't bother him. His commanding appearance already attracted attention. Especially since he'd been celebrated as a hero, it was actually rarer for no one to be looking at all. For that reason, beyond special circumstances like when he had to put on an act or moments spent riding Homisic, the gazes of ordinary people didn't faze him one bit. After a few more deep breaths, his creeping discomfort had abated somewhat, and he finally had the energy to pay some attention to Narbril behind him. Sorry. Was I walking too fast? Ainz was wearing armor, but there was still a big difference between his manly gait and Narbril's feminine stride, even though she wore a robe. Considering her strength, it probably wasn't an issue, but as a man, he still felt the need to apologize for pushing ahead without considering her. No, not at all. Okay, did she only answer that way because she's my servant? Or is it really not bothering her? Unsure, Ainz shortened his stride and tried to come up with a topic for conversation. Feeling a bit embarrassed about how on edge he'd been up until now, he racked his brains for something to talk about but couldn't come up with anything suitable. Small talk among salesmen generally consisted of benign topics like the weather. Sports wasn't bad either, but that required knowing the other person's favorite team ahead of time. Ainz was trying to think of something like that to bring up as he mentally cursed under his breath. Why should I have to tiptoe around Narbril? She's my subordinate. This is a perfect chance to practice conversing with underlings while role-playing as a ruler. But I wonder what would be good for a ruler, or rather, I wonder what sorts of things absolute beings chat about. Ainz recalled the everyday conversations he used to have with his boss at the office and wondered if that would go over well or not. He was the elite ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, not a corporate executive. If anything, his position was more comparable to that of a company president. It's not quite the same as a president. I wonder what kind of conversations the ruler of the kingdom has with Gazef Stronov. I wish I could use that as a point of reference. It was a bit late in the game to be mulling over this type of thing. Walking in silence any longer would be awkward. Still unsure if it was a good topic, Ainz desperately broached one. Hey, Nabe. What do you think of my voice? Ainz poked at his vocal cords, or more accurately, the place where they would have been. He touched his gauntlets to the spot on his neck where he normally would have felt only metal, but there was something squishy inside, plus an out-of-place dampness inside his throat. To be quite honest, I don't much care for it. Not that it's an odd voice, of course. I merely prefer Lore, Mr. Mommon's normal one. I understand the circumstances, but I do sometimes wish you would go back to your regular voice. I see. I think it's pretty nice and elegant. Neuronist chose it from among the voices of 50 people, so it's only natural that it would have a certain charm. Ainz suddenly groaned after remembering a time he'd heard a recording of his own voice, but his psyche was immediately stabilized. Is that so? I like your normal one better. Thanks, Nabe. Still, I didn't even think I would be able to equip this thing. Ainz poked his neck again, wondering if Narbril meant what she said or whether she was only flattering him. He felt the creature attached to his throat, a lip bug, move. If he were human, it probably would have tickled. Did I just not know? Or did it get changed in a patch? These kinds of gaps in knowledge could prove dangerous. What a pain that I have to verify my information of this world and what I learned in Yggdrasil. The creators of Yggdrasil wanted their players to enjoy the unknown. Hoping to give people motivation to experiment, the developers revealed a vast amount of data alongside a system worth tinkering with. Thus, a true unknown spread out before the players. There was hardly any useful info available about the map, nor details about the various dungeons, how to mine ores, what was edible, what types of magic beasts could be kept, and so on. Everything was left completely unexplained. In the world of Yggdrasil, players had to discover all this information themselves. To put it plainly, they even had to use trial and error to figure out what they could and could not equip. Sure, there were walkthrough sites and information pages, but most were nothing more than collections of widely known facts or contained tips of dubious veracity. Yggdrasil was a game of exploring the unexplored, and any intelligence acquired was a treasure. There was no benefit to making it freely available to strangers. The only intelligence that could be trusted came from the guild that a player belonged to or traded for with a dependable guild. The rest was generally considered to be worthless. There was even a period when completely suspicious posts, to the effect of "I left my guild, so I'm revealing all the info we were hoarding," popped up. Well, there was some true stuff buried among the lies, but there was one guild called the Flaming Third Eye. It was formed by someone who ran a members-only paid Yggdrasil wiki. They committed the atrocious deed of sending spies to infiltrate elite guilds and steal intelligence. Only the admins didn't consider it reprehensible. They tacitly approved it as a valid way to acquire information, but that didn't fly with those who had been robbed. When public fury reached its peak, the elite guilds formed an alliance and attacked the Flaming Third Eye. Players camped the spying guild's respawn points, their guild base, and the shrine in town, PKING them over and over every time their victims came back to life. In the end, the Flaming Third Eye was destroyed, to the point where their members scattered to the four winds. Ainz fondly recalled how they opened up their wiki for free after that. Well, there weren't any spies in Ainz Ooal Gown, but if it weren't for that whole mess, we might have had more members. The incident triggered a freeze on welcoming new members into the guild, and they ended up topping out at 41, the smallest membership out of the top guilds. In Yggdrasil's later days, it was possible that there had been sites publishing only reliable information, but Ainz mostly pored over those back in the good old days when the guild Ainz Ooal Gown was at its peak. There hadn't been much useful info at the time. My knowledge basically cuts off back then. I at least kept an eye on patch notes. There must be other Yggdrasil players in this world besides me, though. I have to keep in mind that I might be at a disadvantage on the intelligence front. By gaining control of the Eight Fingers, their knowledge of the area surrounding Nazarick had jumped. Ainz had learned a lot about the kingdom as well as the empire, and now they were putting that knowledge to good use. But there hadn't been much about the sacred kingdom known as the theocracy or the council state, so they needed to cautiously gather intelligence on those. Sheesh. Thinking about it only brings up more anxiety. I'm ready to talk about something more cheerful. Ainz paused there and took a quick look around. The empire sure is lively. It seems just like Irantal to me. At Narbrel's response, he looked around again. The streets are animated, and the people walking about have a gleam in their eyes. It's a sign that they feel their lives will improve over time. Narbrel, walking a fair bit behind him, was saying something along the lines of "Brilliant observation, Mr. Mammon," but Ainz didn't reply. He was too busy feeling embarrassed over what he had said aloud. It was simply the feeling he got, but he didn't trust his eyes. It's not like I'm trying to be like Pandora's actor or something. A sign? How could I say something so pretentious and not be mortified? Do I think I'm a poet? He had to act like a hero to some extent back in the kingdom, but it seemed like he was still performing even now. With shame blooming on his face beneath his helmet, not that his bare skull could actually blush, of course, Ainz caught sight of the influtter had recommended up ahead. Even at a distance, it was clear that the best accommodations in the imperial capital were superior to those in Irantal. Still, that was only based on a practical impression of the facilities. If Irantal's best lodgings were a luxurious inn with a sense of history, then this building was more like a posh, newly opened hotel. Deciding which one was better came down to a matter of taste. Well, we can't be sure until we go in, but the atmosphere is pretty unmistakable. Ainz gave a quick once-over to the proof that he was an adamantite rank adventurer hanging around his neck before stepping toward the entrance. Like in Irantal, there were muscular guards in leather armor stationed by the door. The men glanced suspiciously at Ainz and Narbrel as they came through the arch, but their eyes popped open after resting on a certain point. Are those real? It seemed so, what with the impressive gear and all, but Ainz heard one of the men conferring with the other in a low voice. When he approached the guards standing at attention, who were unable to conceal their nervousness, one of them asked politely in an extremely strained voice, "Excuse me, Sir Adamantite rank adventurer. I'm sorry to trouble you, but might I examine your plate?" Ainz took his off for inspection. Does this inn refuse first-timers? Yes. It's true that to maintain a certain dignity, we do turn people away unless they have a suitable introduction. Naturally, adamantite rank adventurers are an exception. After wiping his hands on his clothes, the guard bowed and gingerly received the plate with his hands. Then, he turned it over and read the words on the back. Sir, Mammon of Raven Black? That's right. Then you are all set. Thank you for presenting your adamantite plate. The guard was still very gingerly handling the plate as he returned it. Plates indicating adventurer ranks were made of the same metal as the rank name, so even this tiny name tag was worth an immeasurable fortune. It was extremely hard, so there was no way it would become scratched if it fell, but the compensation for losing it would be anything but small. There was no lack of stories where just as someone was about to return a gold plate, a crow-like bird called a quolamberat would snatch it out of their hands. They weren't parables for urging people to handle plates with care, it was a recounting of something that had really happened. When Ainz took the plate back, the two guards' shoulders visibly relaxed in relief. I'll be going in now. Yes, sir. I'll escort you to the front desk, thank you. The kingdom doesn't have a tipping system, so the empire is probably the same, right? Ainz wondered absent-mindedly while one of the two guards led him inside. They passed through the lobby, which had a floor that seemed to be made of marble, then headed for reception. This is adamantite rank adventurer Sir Mammon and his companion. After the elegant man behind the counter signaled with his eyes, the guard bowed respectfully to Ainz and returned to his post. Welcome, Sir Mammon. We appreciate you choosing us for your stay in the imperial capital. The receptionist bowed deeply. No, don't worry about it. Anyway, I'll do one night for starters. Very well. Then would you sign the register, please? Ainz wrote the signature he'd practiced dozens of times in the language of the kingdom. Thank you. And what kind of room would you like? Personally, Ainz was fine with an inexpensive room. But as expected, that wouldn't do. I can't eat, so I'd be fine without food, but... Ainz recalled various meals of this world, thick, green, sweet-smelling fruit water, something like pink scrambled eggs, sliced meat covered in a blue liquid. They all piqued his curiosity, but he couldn't eat any of them. No desire for sex, food, sleep. There are a lot of handy things about this body, but I've lost a lot, too. It's too bad. Of course, if I had kept my flesh, there's a good chance I'd be overindulging. Suddenly imagining himself in bed with Albedo, his face twisted slightly, something that went further than a manager sexually harassing a female subordinate woman popped into his head. Albedo seems to love me, but it's complicated. If only I hadn't. Sorry. Anything suitable is fine. By the way, is it all right if I pay in kingdom gold instead of trade currency? Not a problem. In the first place, the exchange rate between kingdom and imperial currency is 1-to-1. I see. Then I'll leave it up to you. Understood. We'll prepare a suitable room, Sir Mammon. Would you mind waiting in the lounge? Ainz's attention turned toward the 50-seat bar. It was overflowing with class. There was ample room between each comfortable-looking chair, and a bard was softly playing a tune. All food and drink in the lounge is on the house, so please make yourself at home. It would seem that no matter the world, services rendered were always commensurate with the amount a customer paid, not that there was anything for Ainz to be particularly happy about in this case. Got it. Okay, Nabe, let's go. Ainz took her over to the bar, and they sat in the nearest open seats. There were several other guests in the lounge. Most seemed to be adventurers. The amount a high-ranking adventurer made for completing a single job was extraordinary. Their standard of living improved as a matter of course, and staying at a place like this became second nature. It was probably like that in every city. After all, Irantal had been the same. Ainz made sure the plate indicating his rank was clearly visible. If they become a topic of conversation, their reputation as adventurers would rise, and there was nothing wrong with that. Conscious of the attention gathering on them, Ainz picked up the menu that had been left in front of him. I can't read this. He flipped through it haphazardly. The reason he'd opened it, despite knowing he wouldn't be able to read it, was to avoid looking suspicious. He did have the reading item he'd lent to Seabass before, but he couldn't casually use it here. Seabass. Swear, as he recalled his subordinate's face, the name of the woman Seabass was involved with slipped out. What about her? Oh no, it's nothing. I just wonder if she's getting along all right. He'd left her care in Seabass's hands, but since Ainz had vowed to protect, it was his role as manager to keep tabs on his employee. I don't think there are any issues. The head maid is in disciplinary confinement, so Sir Seabass is with her at all times, teaching her the various duties. Once she learns enough etiquette, her lessons will expand to include cooking and other tasks. Then, after determining her aptitude, she'll get her official assignment. I see. Well, as long as she has Seabass, she'll be fine, right? And isn't it about time those two were released? Albedo's anger has subsided somewhat by now, hasn't it? Narbril said nothing and lowered her head slightly. Perhaps noticing a pause in their conversation, a waiter approached. Have you made your selections? I'll have an ice macchiato. What about you, Nabe? The same. You can order whatever you like, you know. Yes, but I'll have the same, please. But please make mine with extra milk. Understood. The waiter bowed deeply and quietly withdrew. A macchiato was a drink that was the same color as a café latte, which Ainz had often seen at inns in Irantal. The smell was also similar to a café latte, but he knew that both coffee and lattes existed in this world. Incidentally, Ainz didn't know what a macchiato tasted like. It went without saying, but he couldn't drink. He experimented once, but the contents simply sloshed out the bottom of his jaw and he couldn't sense any taste at all, so there was literally no point. Nonetheless, the reason he'd ordered it was that he figured it was appropriate since the drink only seemed to be available at high-class establishments. Wiping away some non-existent sweat, he asked Narbril an obvious question. Nabe, what does a macchiato taste like? He asked, because he knew she'd had one before. For a little while, she looked like she was thinking it over. The expression she had was the same as someone who wondered how best to describe the flavor of coffee to someone who had never drunk it. It's similar to a café chocolato. But I don't enjoy the faint condensed milk aftertaste. I see. Sounds tasty. Chocolato? Never heard of it. There's a very good chance it's something original to this world. I would rate it as not bad. Just as Ainz hummed thoughtfully, their drinks arrived. Go ahead. If neither of us touches our drinks, it'll seem weird. He'd gotten so used to his helmeted lifestyle in the kingdom that he said this, completely forgetting how unnatural it was to keep his helmet on even when someone brought him a drink. Thank you. It's fine if you keep drinking, but please listen. I'm thinking about taking 2 days to see the imperial capital. I heard the central market is surprisingly well stocked, enough that you can have fun just walking around and browsing. And there's also the northern market. I heard it sells mainly magic items and that adventurers often go there. That information was obtained from the Eight Fingers organization that they now dominated. There was more underground type intelligence, but Ainz wasn't planning on sticking his own nose into those affairs, so he'd only skimmed the documents. On the 3rd day, let's go to the Adventurers Guild. If possible, I'd like to make the acquaintance of the Empire's adamantite rank adventurers, but if that's impossible, let's do a short, simple job to make ourselves known. If we can get out of here within 7 days, that would be best. Any suggestions or anything? Narbril, who had stopped drinking to listen, shook her head. The imperial capital was a physical manifestation of the Empire's power that contained multiple astounding sights, but almost everyone who visited marveled at one thing the most: nearly every road was paved with brick or stone. None of the nearby countries, not even the theocracy, though it was more advanced than most, could match the quality of these roads. Not that every city in the empire was similarly outfitted, but still, seeing the capital was enough for visiting diplomats to understand and admire the empire's potential. The main street was especially grand. One of the imperial capital's largest roads, the main street was contiguous with the highway. Like ordinary roads, carriages and horses moved down the center, and pedestrians walked on the sides. What set it apart were the various safety provisions. A simple guardrail was built on the boundary between the sidewalk and the street. Having the sidewalk a step up provided additional protection for pedestrians. There were also lamps along the side of the road that shone magic light on the streets at night, as well as many patrolling knights. Down this street, the safest in the empire, walked a man with a silly grin on his face, humming a cheerful tune. He stood about 5'7". Age-wise, he was probably almost 20. Blonde hair, blue eyes, healthy tan skin, a man with features you could find anywhere in the empire. He wasn't handsome. He was only average and wouldn't stand out in a crowd. Still, there was something appealing about him. Perhaps it had something to do with the faint, merry smile on his face and the confident way he carried himself. With each step, each swing of his arms, the sound of chain links rubbing together came from under his fine, immaculate clothes. A perceptive passerby would gather that he was wearing mail. He wore a sword on either hip, short swords, going by length. Knuckle guards covered the grips completely. The scabbards weren't elaborate, but they didn't look cheap. Farther around behind the swords, he wore a blunt weapon, a mace. He also had an armor piercer. Carrying a weapon or two in this world was only natural, but there weren't many people who had 3 different attack types, piercing, cutting, and crushing, at the ready. Someone who knew a thing or two would figure him for an adventurer. Someone who knew a little more would no doubt notice the lack of a plate adventurers usually wore around their necks and realize that he was a worker. Workers. Adventurer dropouts. Adventurer jobs were contracted by the guild, investigated, and then assigned to adventurers of suitable rank. In other words, the guild screened requests at the earliest stage to make sure they were appropriate. It refused questionable jobs, ones that threatened civilian safety or involved crime, and sometimes blacklisted the requester. For example, the guild did everything in its power to block requests to procure plants used to make drugs. The guild also rejected jobs that would disrupt the balance of an ecosystem. For example, it wouldn't send adventurers to proactively kill the monster at the top of a forest's food chain. If the monster was killed, the ecosystem's balance would be destroyed, and monsters might appear outside the forest. The guild wanted to avoid that. Of course, it was a different story if the monster at the top of the food chain left the forest and invaded an area where humans lived. In other words, adventurers were like allies of justice. But pretty ideals alone couldn't make the world go round. There were people who simply wanted money, willing to do dangerous jobs for good rewards. There were even people who merely enjoyed killing monsters. Those who pursued darkness rather than light, those who dropped out of the adventurer system, they were the ones people, with a mix of scorn and wariness, called workers. But that didn't mean everyone who became a worker was that type of person. For example, say a boy was seriously injured in a certain village. Could an adventurer who happened to be passing through heal his wounds for free using magic, yes or no? The answer is no. There was a rule that forbid adventurers from casting healing magic without charging the prescribed fee. Normally, healing fell within the jurisdiction of the shrines. Sick people made an offering to receive the effects of healing spells. If adventurers disregarded that and healed people for free, the shrines wouldn't be able to stay in business. So the shrines made firm requests to the guild to prevent that scenario. Anyone who disagreed with that sort of rule had no choice but to become a worker. From this perspective, the shrines seem almost like villains, but it was precisely because they had revenue from healing that they could work for the people without getting heavily involved in politics. The funds to train priests, exorcise undead, develop new healing spells, and generally make people's lives happier and safer also came from this revenue stream. If adventurers cast healing magic for free, the shrines would end up growing secular, their ideology tarnished. Everything has two sides to it, a front and a back. That went for workers, as well. Cases of workers who would overhunt for money so they could make cheaper medicine to help people were not non-existent. The grinning man, Hecarim Termite, was a worker by trade. Wonder what I should buy. The list of magic items he wanted was endless. He figured it would be better to prioritize defensive accessories for the moment. Though there was one more thing. It was unrelated but something he wanted. I'll save up money for that separately, and use what's left to buy magic items for adventures. Is that backward? I'll buy the items and any leftover will go toward that. Hecarim scratched his head. But then, as the one out front, I should raise my magic resistance. Maybe it's about time to cut into my savings. But assuming we're going to the Katsa plain to make some cash exterminating undead, I should be on guard against toxins and stuff, so maybe items that boost resistance to poison, paralysis, and sickness would be better. Magic items were extremely expensive, and the types adventurers were liable to want, ones useful in combat, tended to cost even more. Unique items fetched prices that kept them out of Hecarim's reach. The items he had in mind at the moment weren't so extreme, but they would still cost a normal person's annual pay several times over. It was an expensive shopping trip. He had to decide carefully. His expression, a bit giddy in anticipation of a splurge, tightened up the moment his eyes met those of a knight. A duo composed of two knights, wearing heavy and light armor respectively, stood on the corner keeping watch over the area. This district, where the shrines to the four gods were located, was known for its strict security. The knights wouldn't question ordinary passers-by, but Hecarim sensed their gazes beginning to focus on the weapons hanging from his hips. He didn't know how it was for adventurers, but as a worker with no support, he definitely didn't want to get in a fight with a knight. His wish was heard, and he managed to traverse the shrine area without being stopped by the knights comparing faces with wanted flyers. Hecarim definitely had things to hide. Relieved, he shifted his gaze down the road and saw, quite a ways in the distance, a peculiar structure. At the same time, he heard a cheer on the wind, along with something like a bloodthirsty battle cry. This unique building could only be found in the imperial capital, the Grand Arena. It was one of the city's most popular sites. Since he saw his fill of blood in his line of work without going to the arena, and he wasn't interested in gambling, the place held little fascination for him. Still, as one might expect for the most popular entertainment for the masses, they were having a full house if the cheers were anything to go by. Must be the final round of the main fight, judging from the hubbub. The worker team Hecarim led had appeared once for work in a program where they were pit against a succession of magical beasts. Surrender wasn't allowed in beast fights, in other words, defeat meant death. Of course, people also died in human-on-human battles. There was rarely an arena day that ended without a death. No, the more people died, the more feverish the atmosphere. And out of all the deadly events, the most popular was the tournament. Hecarim shrugged. He'd lost interest completely. He didn't feel like staring at a bloody, reeking battlefield on his day off. The only reason he couldn't get it out of his head was that arena events made for good conversation starters in all sorts of places. I never want to go to the arena again, but when I get back later, it wouldn't be a bad idea to ask someone about the events. Making a mental note, Hecarim continued walking down the street lined with stores on either side. Before long he came upon the familiar sign of the Singing Apple. It was a pub and said to have started with a gathering of bards who played instruments made from apple trees. The interior was surprisingly nice. No drafts, and the floors were polished clean. Granted, it cost a fair amount, too, but it wasn't beyond their means. For Hecarim's group, no, workers in general, one could even say it was the best inn. Certainly, compared to the most high class in the imperial capital had to offer, it was inferior on every level. But those fancy places were perfect for adventurers, not workers. First of all, most of the jobs that came workers' ways were dirty, so requesters would hesitate to show up somewhere it would be conspicuous to visit. On the other hand, basing their operations in a rough part of town could invite trouble. The other reason requesters liked the Singing Apple was that multiple worker teams could stay there. Since there was no guild for workers like there was for adventurers, people who wanted to hire a team had to track them down on their own. If they were scattered all over the place, business would have been inconvenient. One advantage workers had was that by staying at the same inn, they developed a sense of closeness, and they ended up avoiding jobs that would involve killing one another. Last, but certainly not least, the food at the Singing Apple was delicious. Hecarim walked through the door with his mind on the evening meal. He thought it would be great if they served his favorite, pork stew. The words that leaped into his ears when he went inside were not "welcome back" or "how was your day" from his friends. Which is why I said I don't know. Even so, it's not like I'm her guardian or something. We're not family. How should I know where she is? Aren't you friends? Even if you say you don't know, I can't just say, "I see," and be on my way. This is for work. A man and woman were glaring at each other in the center of the pub and dining hall on the first floor. Hecarim knew the woman very well. There was nothing special about her face and its currently hostile look. What attracted the most attention was her longer than normal ears. That said, they were only about half as long as an elf's. Yes, she was half-elf. Elves were more slender creatures than humans, and it was clear from a glance that she shared their blood. She was thin overall, and neither her chest nor her backside had any trace of smooth feminine curves. She was flat as a washboard. From her build alone, even up close, she was liable to be mistaken for a man. She wore form-fitting leather armor. She wasn't carrying her usual bow and quiver, but instead, a dagger dangled from her hip. Her name was Emina. She was one of Hecarim's teammates. But the man facing her was someone he didn't know. He was bobbing his head to beg her pardon, but his eyes didn't seem sorry at all. On the contrary, there was something unpleasant in them. Judging from his humble attitude, though, he didn't seem to be a total idiot. With his arms and chest practically bursting with muscles, his appearance alone made his presence seem like a threat. He was probably someone who wouldn't hesitate to use violence, but he couldn't hope to appeal to Emina by force. Why? Because although she looked delicate, enough ability lurked within her that she could kill a cocky hoodlum with no trouble. But it's like I've been telling you. At this shrill, greatly irritated scream, Hecarim interrupted. Emina, what are you doing? Emina turned around, just then noticing him at the sound of his voice, and looked surprised. It seemed that despite her superior ranger senses, she had lost herself in the conversation and failed to sense him. The oversight spoke to how agitated she must have been. What do you want? The man asked in a threatening tone, clearly considering Hecarim an intruder. His eyes were hostile, and it seemed like he might start throwing punches at any moment. Of course, to Hecarim, who had faced ferocious monsters and lived, the man's threats were worth about a wry grin. He's our leader, well then. Hecarim Termite, correct? I've heard so much about you. The man's expression morphed dramatically into an ingratiating smile, making Hecarim hate him just a bit. He didn't know why the man had come, but he had made it all the way here, to their base. The possibility he didn't know Hecarim was practically non-existent. The threat in the man's voice had likely been to gauge what kind of person Hecarim was. If he backed off even a little, the man probably would have continued in that high-handed vein. Some workers and adventurers had no problem slaying monsters but were reluctant to face humans. Of course, most of them would take a mile if given an inch and attack to kill. He threatens me to decide who's top dog the moment we meet? I just can't get myself to like this kind of guy. Hecarim knew that it was just one way of negotiating, an obvious technique. But he didn't like that sort of negotiation. He liked his business straightforward with no hidden purposes. This is an inn, you know. There are other guests here, too, so could you keep it down? That's what he said, but actually, there were no other guests to be seen, or, for that matter, employees. It wasn't as if they were hiding. To workers, this amount of commotion was like a morsel to go with their drinks. It was only by chance that no one was around. Hecarim gave the man a hard stare. It was too much to stand tall against the piercing eyes of a warrior who would have been mithril rank as an adventurer. The stranger shrank as if he were facing a magical beast. No, no. My apologies, but I can't do that. The man lowered his voice slightly and was about to continue. The fact that he could do that under Hecarim's gaze meant he had to be in some line of work, most likely the violent kind, that exercised strength. What in the world is a guy like this doing here? Granted, he himself did underworld work, but he didn't know this man, nor had he any idea why he should be getting so much attitude from him. The guy definitely didn't seem to be fulfilling a request. Confused, Hecarim softened his eyes and decided to ask the man and hear it from him. Who are you? There you go. I came to meet an associate of yours, Mr. Termite, Miss Furt. Only one person by the name of Furt came to mind. I can't imagine her having anything to do with this guy. As her friend who had fought through numerous life and death battles with her, that's what Hecarim concluded. So this must be some kind of trouble. Archie? What about her? Archie. Oh, right. I was confused for a second because we only ever call her Miss Furt. Archie E.B. Ralph Furt, yes. So? What about her? I'd just like a word with her. It's a private matter, so could you tell me what time she'll be back? How should I know? Hecarim ended the conversation gruffly. He was so forceful, the man blinked a few times. Is this conversation over? I guess I have no choice. I'll just wait a little, get lost. Hecarim jerked his jaw toward the entrance. The man's eyelids fluttered again. I'll make myself clear. I don't like you, and it doesn't seem like I ever will. I can't stand having guys like that anywhere I can see. This is a pub, and yeah. You're right, it is a pub. A place where people get drunk and start fights. Hecarim grinned at the man. Relax. Even if you get caught in a brawl and end up seriously wounded, we have a priest who can use healing magic. All you have to do is pay, and we'll fix you up. Of course, there's a surcharge. Otherwise, the shrines get upset. No way I want the shrines to send an assassin after us, Imina chimed in, wearing a villainous sneer. But, well, for you we can discount it. You'd be grateful for that, wouldn't you? You heard her. Are you trying to three? The man's words trailed off, because he saw the worker's expression change dramatically. Hecarim took a big step forward, closing in to the point that each other's faces filled their fields of vision. Threaten? Who, me? It's not so rare for a fight to break out in a pub, right? I'm giving you a friendly warning, and you say I'm threatening you? Are you trying to start something? Hecarim's face, the veins of his brow bulging, was one of a man who had survived countless life and death battles. Defeated, the other man backed up a step but clicked his tongue as his last act of defiance. Then he set off hurriedly toward the door. He was frantically trying to keep up appearances, but it was clear at a glance that just beneath that surface, he was spooked. When he reached the door, he turned just his head and snapped at Hecarim and Imina, "Tell the Furt girl that her time is up." Yeah? At Hecarim's near growl, the man practically tripped over his feet exiting the inn. Once the troublesome roughneck was gone, Hecarim's expression went completely back to normal. The change was so abrupt that if he said he had just been pulling faces for effect, it would have been believable. And in reality, Imina gave him a round of applause. So what was that about? Not sure. He only asked the same stuff you heard just now. Man. Then we probably should have gotten some more out of him first. Dang it. He put a palm over his face. Can't we just ask Archie when she gets back? But I don't really want to go poking into her business. Well, I get that, but you're our leader, so suck it up. I'll exercise my authority as leader to have you ask her as a fellow woman. Gimme a break. I don't want to do it either. They winced at each other. Among both adventurers and workers, a few things were commonly understood to be inappropriate. First, asking about or investigating one another's pasts. Second, displaying excessive desires too openly. Since many people became workers out of ambition, a little greed couldn't be helped, but when it was blatantly over the top, there was a danger they would stop functioning as team players. For example, how easy would it be to trust someone to fulfill a request with lots of cash on the line or keep an important secret when they talked about how much they wanted money every day? Would it be possible to sleep in the same room with someone who was always saying how badly they desired the other sex? Teammates covered one another's backs in situations where their lives were in danger. They had to maintain a minimum level of trust. Being in some kind of obvious trouble dealt a serious blow to Archie's dependability. This wasn't an issue they could simply compromise on. They were risking their lives together, so they couldn't let even a little uncertainty remain. Irritated, Hecarim furiously scratched his head. He didn't forget to wear a "this sucks" face. I guess there's no helping it. Someone has to ask her. Thank you. He gave Emina a deadpan stare as she smiled and waved. What? Trying to run away? You're asking her with me. What? She grimaced, but gave up when she saw that Hecarim's expression didn't crack a bit. Fine. I hope it's nothing too depressing, though. Where did she go anyway? She's investigating that job. Aren't me and Rober supposed to be doing that? They had returned to the Imperial capital and were resting up after finishing a round of undead extermination on the Katsa plain when a new request popped up. The terms weren't bad, so they were leaning toward accepting. The plan was for the best speaker of their bunch, Roberdick, to look into the background of the requester as well as the nature of the job, while Hecarim dropped by the Imperial Government Office to pick up the reward for the undead extermination and then investigated the same things as Roberdick via different sources. Emina and Archie were supposed to be on standby at the inn. Not just that, though. Stuff like the history of the region and current conditions in the location's vicinity. Hecarim nodded that he understood. Archie may have dropped out of the Imperial Magic Academy, but she still had some connections. She would be best at collecting academic knowledge. Maybe she was digging through documents at the Wizards Guild. That's why she said she'd look into things with Rober. He has a fair amount of knowledge himself, plus shrine connections, you know? So what did you find out, then? About that, said Hecarim as he sat down. Then he lowered his voice. I can see why they're hiring workers. Or at least, based on the location, it'd be impossible to hire adventurers. But, and the requester mentioned this, too, it does seem to be true that they're talking to other teams as well. So it's actually a joint job? The requester must be expecting quite a return considering no one's ever set foot in these ruins. Gringham's team got the request, and he was saying the same thing. Heavy Masher seems to be thinking of going. We have to decide what we're doing by tomorrow, too. Hecarim's team only received the request and had yet to accept. They had until the next day to give their response, but if they were going to go, they had all sorts of preparations to make. And then this trouble comes up right when all this is going on. I wonder if it's related. I can't say for sure other teams aren't scheming because they think they can make a killing with this job, but we should talk to Archie first. If one of the other teams is giving her grief, we should either leave the job on the table or take it ready for a fight. We should fight, though, right? If someone tries to start something with us, we should beat on them till all their teeth are chipped away so they never do it again. That seems excessive. Emina was more cutthroat than she looked, but Hecarim didn't think her proposal was a bad idea. If they were underestimated, he wouldn't go as far as to say their careers were over, but people would definitely think less of them. That was something workers, with one foot in the underworld, had to avoid. When he silently nodded with a hard glint in his eye, a creak echoed through the pub. 2 figures entered through the wide-open door. "Hey! We're back." A woman's faint voice. And a moment later, so as not to talk over her, the voice of a well-mannered man came as well. The first to enter was a skinny woman for whom the word girl might still be more appropriate. She was probably in her mid to late teens. Her glossy hair was cropped shoulder length, and she had an extremely pretty face. She was less of a bombshell and more of an elegant beauty. There was something almost inorganic about her, doll-like. She carried an iron rod longer than she was tall. There were numerous letters or symbols, something like that, inscribed on it. She wore a loose, fitting robe. Beneath that, she had thick clothes that gave her some degree of protection. It was a look that made it clear she was a caster. The man was clad in full plate armor, although he didn't go so far as to wear a close helmet. Over it, he wore a surcoat decorated with a sigil. A morning star was slung from his hip, and from his neck hung the same sigil featured on his surcoat. The outline of his face was rugged, but his short hair and bit of a well-trimmed beard gave him a clean-cut appearance. He looked to be around 30. These were Hecarin's other teammates, Ainz Ooal and Robert Galtrin. "Welcome back," Hecarin replied stiffly. "Is this good timing or horrible? Is something the matter, you two?" Robert spoke in a politer tone than would be expected of the oldest member of the group. This stemmed from his personality, but also because they were equals as workers. "No, nothing. That's right. Like he said." Archie and Robert squinted at Hecarin and Imina, flapping their hands. "Well, it's awkward to talk here. How about we go over there?" Cutting to the chase, with an earnest expression, Hecarin pointed at a round table in the back of the pub. "Before that, drinks. Hey, Imina. Where's the innkeeper?" Imina's expression seemed to say, "You're finally asking?" "Shopping. So I'm watching the place for him." "Seriously? Then what should we do? Just drink?" "I'm fine without." "Yeah, me too." "Okay. Then, well, shall we start our meeting, Foresight?" With that, everyone erased all traces of their previous expressions. They leaned in around the table, bringing their faces closer together. Talking in this conspiratorial manner even when no one else was around was like an occupational disease. "First, let's review the content of the request." Hecarin continued after confirming all eyes were on him. His tone was completely different from the one he'd used up until this moment. When it was time to get down to it, he got serious, as was only natural for a leader. "The requester this time is Count Vamir. The request is to survey some ruins in Kingdom territory, a large building, possibly a tomb, that extends underground. The reward is 200 in advance, 150 after. It's rare for a contract to have such a large advance, and the amount overall is pretty big, too. There could also be additional compensation, depending on the outcome of the survey. However, all magic items discovered go to the Count. He'll allow the ones who found them to sell to him at half off the market rate. Jewels, precious metals, and works of art will be split 50-50 after determining their worth. He's been talking to other teams as well and may hire more than one, this we've confirmed." Hecarin filled Archie and Robert in on what he'd heard and then returned to reviewing the content of the request. The survey will be 3 days at the longest. The assignment is to examine the ruins from various angles. The most important thing is that he thinks there are monsters there and wants to know what types and so on. Well, I guess it's a fairly standard ruins investigation. It was quite common for monsters to nest in deserted cities and ruins. For that reason, worker team surveys were usually more like reconnaissance and force missions. Except for one major thing. Supposedly this tomb has yet to be discovered. The moment he said it, the atmosphere changed. A number of countries were destroyed 200 years previously when the evil spirits went on a rampage, not only human countries but subhuman and grotesque nations as well. Sometimes there were extraordinary treasures, usually magic items, sleeping in their ruins. Discovering these treasures was the dream of any adventurer or worker. That's why they all sought ruins that no one had ever looted. Foresight's chance was right in front of them. Also, the Count will provide transportation for the way there and back, as well as food for the duration. I think that's it. Archie, Roberdick, let's hear your report. Noting the gleams in his teammates' eyes, he passed the ball to the two who had been out gathering intelligence, starting with Archie. Then I'll go first. Count Vamir's position at court isn't so great. There was a rumor that the fresh blood emperor treats him coldly. I also heard that he's not hard up for money. We're supposed to survey these ruins in Kingdom territory, but Archie and I both looked and couldn't find any rumors of ruins in that area or any indication that there was a city there in the past. If there really is a tomb there, it wouldn't be strange for some information to have been left behind, but, honestly, it doesn't even make sense for it to exist. Geographically, all that's over there is a little village. If we ask around the village, we might be able to learn something, but we can't do that. We're supposed to keep this under wraps as much as possible, although he did say we don't need to do anything to anyone who sees us, and that he'd rather we didn't. That makes sense. The area is directly under Kingdom jurisdiction. One wrong step and we could make enemies of the Vazel family and the whole country. It was practically a crime to survey ruins in another country's territory, which was why this request had come to workers, not adventurers. So it's just a typical dirty job? Yeah, but there is that one little problem, said Roberdick. Well, yeah. If workers from the Empire got rowdy in the Kingdom, there would be all kinds of issues. If we're not careful, an incident might be possible to trace back to the Count. In that case, there's one question. You mean where the tip about the ruins came from? Yeah. It's weird no matter how you look at it. Really? It's near the Tove Woodlands, right? Couldn't it have just been discovered while clearing the forest? That doesn't make sense. Look at this. Archie spread out a map and drew a circle around one location. I don't know the details, but supposedly it's around here. She moved her small finger and tapped. And here, there's a village, but it's pretty small. More like a hamlet. I highly doubt the people in that village have the wherewithal to clear the forest. You're right. Clearing the dangerous woodlands would be nearly impossible for a tiny village like that. It could be that the Kingdom undertook clearing the forest as a state project, but location-wise, I can't imagine there's a reason they'd be so interested. And in the first place, there's no information floating around about a project like that. The four of them racked their brains. Should we really take this job? Because they didn't have the support of an organization like the Adventurers Guild, they needed to scrutinize the details of each job. First, they looked into the background of the requester, then they researched the location. Only upon then examining the content of the request would they finally take the job. Even after being so thorough, they often ran into trouble. Workers risked their lives on their work. No matter how much they investigated, it would never feel like enough, but they couldn't stay in the business unless they were thorough. If a job seemed too dangerous for them to handle, they had to leave the offer on the table, no matter how good the terms were. When I confirmed about the payment, he gave me the advance. Hecarin set a gold plate on the table. It was inscribed with lots of little letters. If they refused the job, they had to give it back. I checked the gold ticket at the bank, and the full amount has been paid. We can cash it at any time. Gold tickets, managed by the Empire and guaranteed by the bank, were like checks. The downsides were that to make them hard to counterfeit, they were quite elaborate and took time to prepare, and that there was a fee involved, but the benefits were innumerable. In nearby countries, it was usually the Adventurers Guild that did this work, but in the Empire, the tickets were backed by the state. So it's not a trap. Well, I figure we can assume they're serious if they've given us a gold ticket. If it was a trap, there would have been no need to pay such a high advance. Of course, it could have been a ploy to make them think that and lower their guard, but Hecarim couldn't think of a reason a noble he'd never even met would have something against him. Wait. Imina, I'm not finished. I want you to keep your mind a little more open. Sure. Then tell me, there are a few things I don't understand, even for a rush job. For example, hiring multiple teams. Why is he doing that? It was just as Imina said. Considering the time it would take to contact everyone, it was strange to hire multiple teams if he was in a hurry. Not sure. I don't know why it's a rush job in the first place. I haven't heard anything about any of his associates having some sort of emergency, and it's not like there's a ceremony or anything coming up in a few days. If anything, I imagine it's because he's worried the kingdom will discover the ruins? And hiring more teams yields a better chance of success? Hey, Hecarim. Did Gringham's team have any ideas? You think you would tell me if they did? Plus, I had my hands full trying not to leak any of the information we'd acquired while asking him if he'd been contacted. Hecarim shrugged as if saying he didn't know what else he could have done. It could be that the Count has a rival. That is a possibility. That would explain the rush and the large number of workers. Right. Something big happened in the kingdom recently. Not that it seems to have anything to do with these ruins in the Irantal area. Tell us anyhow, Rober, after prefacing his report with I didn't really get much on it and it's basically a rumor. Roberdick gave an uncertain description of the huge incident that had occurred in the royal capital. He said he would need more time to be able to say anything further, but sure enough, as it stood it was a rather unreliable, fractured account. It might be related, but it might not be. For the time being, Archie's idea seems the most plausible. And you agreed, too, Rober. If we make that assumption, then, considering the multiple teams and the fact that it's a job in Kingdom territory, it's possible that we'll be up against Kingdom adventurers there by official request. We wouldn't be able to find that out just by asking around in the Empire. The other thing we have to watch out for is a team requested by someone else, a hidden threat. No way I am getting my head cut off in my sleep right when we think we've accomplished our goal. Are adventurers a threat? They're better than the alternative. At least with adventurers, you can negotiate and it won't get ugly. If it's workers, people will die. What do you think, boss? Nothing had been left unsaid. All they could do now was speculate and make predictions. Before we decide, there's one thing I need to say, well, ask, I guess. Hecarim heaved a sigh, and Imina quietly held her breath. Archie, there was a weird guy here to see you. Archie's almost artificial-looking expression contained barely any emotion, but now her eyebrows twitched. From that reaction, Hecarim gathered that she knew who it was. When he left, he said, "What did he say?" When he turned to Imina, he was met with a "What are you talking about?" Look, but then she realized he really couldn't remember and said in an exhausted voice, he said, "Tell the Furt girl that her time is up." Yeah, that's it. Everyone's eyes turned to Archie. She took a breath and spoke reluctantly. I'm in debt. In debt? Hecarim yelped in spite of himself. Naturally, he wasn't the only one in shock. Imina and Roberdick also looked surprised. They all knew how much each member made as workers, because they split their rewards evenly. With that much going into their pockets, debt was inconceivable. How much? 300 gold, the others exchanged glances again. In terms of an ordinary salary, it was an outrageous amount. Even as workers of their caliber, it was impossible to earn that in one job. Yes, the total for this job would come out to 350, but that was the reward for the entire team. From there, necessary expenses such as communally used consumables plus other team-based spending would be deducted. In the end, they would each get about 60. Their team was fairly elite as worker teams went. In adventurer terms, they had ability equal to a mithril-rank team. How had she managed to go so far into debt that even at their class she couldn't pay it off in one job? Archie probably sensed all their puzzled eyes. Her face was gloomy. Of course, she didn't want to talk about it. But she couldn't not. If she cut off the conversation here, it wouldn't be surprising for her to be kicked off the team. Perhaps realizing that, she finally spoke again. I couldn't tell you because it's humiliating for my family. We were stripped of our noble status by the Fresh Blood Emperor. The Fresh Blood Emperor, Jerknavrun Farlord El Nix. As the sobriquet implied, he was an emperor whose hands were stained with blood. He'd assumed the throne directly after mourning his father, the previous emperor, who died in a freak accident. Immediately following the emperor's death, he broke off relations with one of the 5 great noble families, his mother's family, based on the suspicion that they assassinated the emperor. He then consigned each of his siblings one by one to oblivion. As if carried away on the winds of death that raged across the land, his mother also died in an accident around that time. Of course, there was an opposition. But they were no match for the then crown prince, who had the force of the knights at his disposal. With that overwhelming military power behind him, he cleaned up the nobles as if he were reaping ears of wheat until only the ones who, whether sincerely or not, swore loyalty to the emperor remained, and his assumption of absolute centralized rule was complete. But the Fresh Blood Emperor didn't stop there. He stripped many nobles of their status on the grounds of "we don't need any useless people," and instead, he promoted anyone with ability, including commoners, further solidifying his authority. There were 2 things about this that astounded everyone. One was that the cleanup of opposing nobles, carried out on an impossible scale, was done with such inspired efficiency that it didn't decrease the nation's power. The second was that the emperor who had achieved it was still a young teenager. Nobles who had been ruined by this man weren't hard to find, but, the thing is, my parents are still living as if they're nobles. Of course, they don't have the money for that. So they're borrowing from this sort of nasty guy to make up the difference. The other 3 looked at one another. They were doing a good job hiding it, but it was still possible to detect their irritation, displeasure, and anger. I'm a good caster. I want to join you, a skinny kid holding a staff taller than she was had said. It seemed like Hecarim wasn't the only one recalling how stunned they'd been back then, and how dumbfounded when they found out what she could do. Since then, over 2 years of adventure after adventure, where one wrong step would have meant death, no matter how much money they made, it seemed like her gear had barely changed at all. Now they finally knew why. Are you serious? Want me to give them a real talking to? We should teach them the words of the gods. Or perhaps fists first. Maybe their ears don't have any holes, and we need to start by making some. Please wait. Since I've said this much, let me also say, depending on what happens, I might take my little sisters and leave. You have little sisters? Archie nodded, and the other 3 looked at one another again. They couldn't say it, but they all felt that maybe they should force her to quit this line of work. Certainly, workers made more money than adventurers, but the catch was that the jobs could be extremely dangerous. Foresight meant choosing jobs only after making sure they were safe, but unforeseen issues cropped up all the time. If things went poorly, it was entirely possible Archie could die and leave her sisters behind. But everyone felt they shouldn't poke their noses any further into her business. I see. Well, for now at least we understand your issue. We'll leave you to solve that, but as far as whether or not to accept this job, having said that much, he cast a cold look at Archie. Archie, sorry, but you don't get to vote this time. You don't have to be sorry. It's no problem. I know I might not choose correctly, given my financial troubles. Money can make you blind. Honestly, I'm just glad I'm not getting kicked off the team. What are you talking about? We're lucky to have a caster with your skills. He wasn't just being polite. It was the truth. Especially with regards to the talent she'd been born with. Hecarim and the team had been saved by her miraculous eyes more than a few times. To give a name to Archie's special ability, perhaps something like magic detection eyes. Apparently arcane casters had an invisible aura of magical energy surrounding them, and Archie could see it and know what tiers of magic they could use. It was unnecessary to explain how useful it was to be able to gauge an opponent's power. As far as Hecarim and the others knew, there was only one other person in the Empire with that ability, the greatest, most powerful wizard in the country, Flutter Paradine. In other words, Archie was Flutter's equal, if only when talking about their eyes. I can't believe the Magic Academy let such an outstanding student get away. Truly. You're so young, yet you can use the same tier as me. You might make it to tier 6 someday. That seems hard, but if there were even a slight possibility, I'd be happy. When the atmosphere had relaxed somewhat, Hecarim clapped his hands together. The dry sound drew everyone's eyes. So, are we going to take this job or not? Robertic? I'm fine with it. Imina? Why not? We haven't had a proper job in quite a while. Worker jobs didn't come along so often. Indeed, the previous week they'd been exterminating undead on the Katsa plain, but they were simply paid for how many they killed. Taking on a job from a requester was a bit different. Then, if you're worrying about me, please don't. Even if we don't take this job, I'll find another way to make money. The three of them exchanged glances, and then Imina grinned. No way. Hadn't even crossed our minds. I mean, it's not a bad job, you know. We want that fat reward. Right, Robertic? That's right. We're not doing it for you, but for the many items sleeping in those undiscovered ruins. Isn't that so, Hecarim? Like the man said, Archie, although it's too bad we won't get famous as the ones to discover them. Thank you, everyone. Archie bobbed her head, and the others looked at one another and smiled. Okay, so Archie will come with me to cash the gold ticket. You two, start getting the stuff for our adventure ready. They couldn't slack on checking their magic items, making sure they had rope and oil, all the equipment they'd need for their trip. It was appropriate work for methodical Robertic and Imina with her thief skills. Or maybe Hecarim was just awful at it. Okay, let's get going, but Archie cocked her head as if to say, what? And Hecarim posed the question on his mind. You know, we won't make enough on this job to pay back your debts. It's okay. If I pay that much, I can get him to wait a little longer. We could lend you the rest. Imina chimed in. Sure. You can just pay us back after the next job, added Robertic. They wouldn't just give it to her, that much was a given. The members of Foresight were equals. I'll pass. Really, my parents should be the ones paying it back, but I'll put in my time and do my filial duty. That makes sense. The four of them exchanged glances and then set about their respective tasks. In one district of the imperial capital was a high-class residential district lined with old yet sturdy, formerly gorgeous mansions on spacious plots. As one might expect, the masters of these historic yet by no means outmoded houses were mostly nobles. A noble's residence was a status symbol, and one who didn't decorate their house because they felt it was a waste of money would be ridiculed. Furnishings, jewelry, clothing, house, garden, these elegantly ornamented items were the equivalent of military might on the battlefield of noble society. They accurately conveyed not only a noble's wealth, but also the breadth and depth of their social connections. Living in a shabby house was enough to be looked down upon. For that reason, unless they were of a military temperament and had next to no interest in politics, nobles decked out both themselves and their houses. In a way, it was like a demonstration of martial power, one only people with enough clout could make. Looking around the area, a few things were apparent. The neighborhood was in a very safe part of the capital and was quiet, but the silence seemed to stem from something else. There were many houses that lacked any human presence. And in fact, there wasn't anyone in those houses. They'd been abandoned by former nobles who could no longer maintain them, stripped of their rank by the fresh-blood emperor. Amid the empty boxes were some houses that were still inhabited, but their outer walls had fallen into disrepair and the pruning of the trees in the yard had been neglected. In the sitting room of one of those houses, wearing a hard expression, Archie was welcomed by her parents. Their faces had the well-bred noble look, and they wore well-tailored clothes. "Welcome home, Archie. Welcome back." Before replying to them, she shifted her gaze to the piece of glasswork on the table. It was an extremely elaborate sculpture shaped like a cup and had the prim air peculiar to luxury items. Her brow twitched because she had never seen it before. "What's that?" "This is a piece by the artist Jean." "That's not what I'm asking. This wasn't here before." "Why is it here now?" "Well, because we bought it this morning." Her father's remark, as casual as if he were discussing the weather, sent a wave of shock through Archie's body. "For how much?" "I believe it was 15 gold pieces." "A steal, don't you think?" Archie's shoulders slumped. It was a natural reaction for anyone who had just used their advance to pay off part of a debt only to return home and find that same debt had increased once more. "Why did you buy it?" Any noble would become a laughingstock if they didn't spend money on things like this. Archie couldn't help but give a hostile glare to her father, with that proud look on his face. "We're not nobles anymore." At her words, his face hardened and flushed. "You're wrong." He thumped the table. Perhaps it was lucky that since the sitting room table was so thick, the glass cup didn't budge. Archie had no problem with it breaking, but it probably wouldn't have even fazed her father. He would just think, well, it was only 15 gold pieces. While Archie suppressed her irritation, her father continued shouting, spittle flying from his lips. "Once that wretched fool dies, our family will resume our status as nobles. Our house has supported the empire for over 100 years. I will not forgive this interruption of our glorious history. This is an investment for the future, and besides, by showing off our power like this, we can send a message to that villain that we won't give in." Idiot. That was Archie's opinion of her excitable, arrogant father. That villain was surely the fresh-blood emperor, but he probably didn't care one bit about their family. Plus, shouldn't there have been a better way to get back at him? Prisoner of his own little world, her father couldn't see outside. Archie shook her head weakly. "Would you two please stop fighting?" Her mother's leisurely tone triggered a temporary truce. She stood up and handed Archie a small bottle. "Archie, I bought you some perfume." "How much was it?" 3 gold pieces. "Thanks. That makes 18. She calculated the total in her head as she thanked her mother, took the bottle that had barely anything in it, and put it away in a secure pocket. Archie had a hard time being cold to her mother. And from a certain perspective, things like perfume and makeup could be considered smart purchases. If she dressed up and attended the right party, a powerful noble might fall in love with her. The idea that a woman's happiness was in marriage, pregnancy, and child-rearing was considered correct by most nobles. Buying those sorts of things as an investment toward that end wasn't so wrong. Still, she didn't feel it was appropriate to be shelling out for perfume right now, considering the family's situation. An ordinary household could sustain itself for a month on 3 gold. "I've told you a million times, but you shouldn't waste money. Only buy the minimum daily necessities." "But I just told you. This is a necessity." Her father cast an exasperated look at her, his face splotchy with rage. They'd had this conversation any number of times, and it always ended in a compromise. Archie partly blamed herself for things having gotten this bad. If she had made some kind of power move earlier on, this wouldn't have happened, and she wouldn't have caused trouble for her teammates in Foresight. "I'm not contributing any more money to this household. I'm taking my sisters and leaving." This quiet announcement made her father furious. His first thought was probably, then who'll make the money, she thought icily. "Who do you think has supported you up until now?" "I've repaid my debts to you," she declared. The money she had given them already was quite a sum. And it was money made on adventures that was supposed to go toward growing stronger with her friends. Of course, everyone was free to use their rewards how they liked, but there was a tacit understanding that a good part of the funds would go toward building up their strength. What had her friends thought of her, seeing that she never bought new gear? Not upgrading her equipment meant that one of the team's members was weaker than the others. But no one ever said anything to her about it. She'd taken advantage of their goodwill. Archie scowled fiercely. It was a gaze that conveyed her tenacious will, and her father averted his eyes like a coward. Of course he did. There was no way Archie, who had survived any number of life and death battles, could lose to a foolish noble. With a glance at her father, who had nothing more to say, Archie left the room. She closed the door behind her and sighed. Then a voice addressed her, as if it had been waiting for the chance. "Mississippi, Jimes, what is it?" Jimes was the family's longtime butler. His wrinkled face was taut with worry. She knew why immediately, because she'd seen the expression several times since her father was stripped of his noble status. "It pains me to bring this sort of thing up with you, miss, but," Archie interrupted him with a raised hand to indicate he needn't say any more. She had the feeling it wasn't a conversation they should have right outside the sitting room, however, and they moved a short distance away. Archie took a small leather pouch from her breast pocket and opened it. There were various gleams inside. Most of them were silver and then copper. Precious few were gold. "Will this be enough somehow?" When Jimes took the pouch and examined its contents, his face softened slightly. "This should suffice for my salary and to repay the merchant." "Good." Archie sighed with relief that ends would somehow meet, even though the family was hovering near bankruptcy. "You couldn't stop him from shopping?" "No. The seller came with a noble he knows." "I did try a few times, but," "I see," they both sighed. "I wanted to ask you. If I were to let all the staff go, what is the minimum amount of money I would need to prepare?" Jimes's eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled sadly. The fact that he wasn't shaken must have meant he'd been expecting it. "I'll make an approximate calculation and inform you later." "Thanks." Just then they heard the sound of scampering footsteps coming down the hall. Archie didn't have to look to know who it was. The corners of her mouth relaxed into a weak smile, and she turned around to see a single figure dashing toward her. It plowed straight into her without slowing. The one who leaped at her was a girl scarcely over 3 feet tall. She must have been about 5 years old. Her eyes looked very much like Archie's. She puffed out her pink cheeks in disapproval. "You're so hard." She wasn't calling Archie's chest flat. Clothing for adventures that made generous use of treated leather provided good defense. The pieces covering Archie's chest and abdomen were particularly tough. That's what the little girl had jumped into. She probably felt like she'd been crushed. "Are you okay?" Archie caressed her face and patted her head. "Yep, I'm okay, Archie." The little girl grinned, and Archie smiled at her younger sister. "I'll take my leave." Archie nodded at the butler as he withdrew to give them space, and then she ruffled her sister's hair. "You're running might not." Having said that much, she hesitated. It was absolutely improper for a noble's daughter to run down the hall, but as she had told her father, they weren't nobles anymore. Wasn't it fine to let her run around, then? Archie's hand hadn't stopped moving during that time, and the little girl, getting her hair messed up, erupted in carefree giggles. Archie looked around and saw that the other one wasn't there. "Where's Could?" "In our room." "Oh yeah, there's something I want to talk to you guys about." "Let's go find her." "Okay." Her smile so cheerful. "It's my job to protect it." With that strong sense of mission, Archie took her sister's hand. She could feel the warmth of the little hand completely surrounded by her own. "Your hands are hard, Archie." Archie looked at her free hand. Cut numerous times during adventures and calloused, they were no longer the hands of a daughter of a noble family. She didn't regret it, though. Her hands were proof of her time with her friends, foresight. But I love them. Archie smiled as her sister squeezed her hand. Thanks. The imperial capital's northern market was bustling with activity as usual. But since most of the shoppers who came here weren't ordinary folk, the crowd wasn't jam-packed like the central market. Here it was possible to walk along the rows of stalls and browse without bumping into people. Hecarin and Roberdick arrived and began strolling around, relaxed in the familiar atmosphere. They could be so easygoing, as if the words on guard had been erased from their dictionary, because there were no pickpockets or other robbers. It was possibly the safest place in the whole safe capital. So, Hecarin, what are we going to buy? First, healing items. Price-wise, I'm aiming for slight cure wounds wands or maybe middle cure wounds wands. But not if they have only half their uses left. Since we're going to a tomb, we might end up using them on undead, too. Besides those, we'll want basic undead countermeasures, items that will work against poison and disease. If possible, I'd like to make sure we have stuff that will work against negative energy and incorporeal undead, too. Items with permanent enchantment are expensive, so any scrolls with the right magic will do fine. Wands were items containing multiple uses of a spell, so the rate per cast ended up cheaper than single-use scrolls. Thus, it was possible to save money by buying wands of commonly used spells, like ones to heal wounds. Is that so? I thought maybe you were here to buy a gift and that you invited me to get my opinion. A gift? Never mind, Hecarin. Let's find those bargains. Alright. The shops at this open-air market carried a lot of shabby-looking items. Most of the stalls were a single thin board as a display table with only one thing on it. Almost nothing was new, they were mainly scruffy, worn-out, second-hand items. The keepers of these shops seemed fairly capable themselves, for the most part. With thick biceps or the look of a magic caster, these sellers seemed like they would be better at battle than setting prices or haggling. At first glance, it appeared that security guards were manning the shops, but they really were the shopkeepers, for this one day only. Normally they made their livings as adventurers or workers. In other words, they were in the same line of work as Hecarin and Roberdick. They were selling things they had been using or items they had discovered on their adventures, but which wouldn't be used by someone on their team, stuff they didn't need. Finding a buyer themselves rather than selling to a merchant who specialized in magic items or the Wizards Guild was better for both sellers and buyers, even considering the small fee paid to the Commerce Guild to set up shop. That's why most workers and adventurers like Hecarin and his friends tended to come here first. Some people even showed up daily during their stay at the capital to hunt for deals. It was also the reason there was virtually no crime in the northern market. Who would willingly attempt to prey on shopkeepers specialized in combat? They would deserve whatever awful things happened to them. After looking around for a little while, Hecarin and Roberdick's faces weren't grim, but they weren't cheerful either. Nothing. The items on sale were ones their owners didn't need, so naturally Hecarin and his team didn't need most of them either. If they had been lower-rank adventurers or green workers, they might have bought some things, but unfortunately, there was nothing they wanted, even with the needs of their two other teammates in mind. That's too bad. Maybe it would have been faster to just buy things normally. Well, we came hoping for deals. Can't help it if there aren't any. This sort of persistent frugality is step one of saving money, you know. Saving money, what do you think will happen, Hecarin? I'd be a super elite caster if I knew what you were talking about just from that. Archie, right? See, you know. Well, I was kinda able to guess from the thread of our conversation, so you know what I'm trying to say then, right? You mean that this might be our last adventure? Please don't say it in such a depressing way. Roberdick winced. But I suppose you're not far off. Archie was talking about taking in her little sisters. If that happens, it won't be very easy for her to go adventuring. Yeah, guess not. She'll have to pick up a trade or find some job where she can make money without traveling. I'm sure she'll find a job fast enough. She's a caster who can use tier 3 spells. I don't know how many little sisters she has, but she should be able to make enough to support a family of 3 or 4. Yes, most likely. She wouldn't say she would take them in if she didn't have the means. So then we're the ones with the problem. If our wizard leaves the team, what'll we do to get a new member? Wonder if there are any free tier 3 arcane casters around. Please save the dreams for bedtime. If we were adventurers, we could have the guild find someone for us, but looking on our own, it will mainly come down to luck. The pair looked at each other and sighed in unison. The death of a friend, being unable to keep up, or being more capable than the rest of the team, those were the types of reasons adventurers and workers quit their teams. It certainly wasn't an uncommon occurrence. On the contrary, being with the same team for one's entire career was quite rare, and most people switched 2 or 3 times. That went for Hecarim, Roberdick, and Imina as well. But that was an entirely different issue from whether they would be able to easily find an arcane caster, not to mention one who could use tier 3 spells. We could get someone who can use tier 2 and train them up. Shouldn't that be our last resort? I'd rather not train someone if we can help it. Poaching someone would be tricky. And so many workers are morally bankrupt to begin with, we really need to be careful who we team up with. No combat maniacs or whatnot, in that sense, our team is kind of a miracle. The unusual case of a team that came together simply because we all just wanted money. Well, I guess we found out about Archie's issues after the fact, so not quite. Miss Archie showed up right as we were trying to figure out what to do about our final member. Roberdick was looking off into the distance. Hecarim figured his eyes must have been doing the same thing. I even remember what I was drinking that day. Her appearance was so timely, it made me think that perhaps the gods formed our team. Really? I don't remember it as well as you, Rober. What were you drinking? Water. That's what you always drink. You basically never touch the hard stuff. I'd hate it if you drank as much as Imina, but Imina sure is a handful when she's drunk. Anyhow, it's not my fault I can't stomach it. Well, yeah, you turn red, blue, and then white from just one glass. I wonder how it would have been if you hadn't protected yourself against poison the first time you drank. Maybe you'd have a different teammate standing here instead of me. Some people die from alcohol, you know. Roberdick shrugged. Let's get back to the topic at hand. What should we do if Archie leaves? Is there a chance we'll disband? If we can't find another member, that'll be our only choice, won't it? It's too dangerous to take jobs with only 3 of us. Maybe we could go back to being adventurers? I absolutely refuse to follow the shrine's rules when all I want to do is save people. If it came to that, I would just retire. Retire. That wouldn't be so bad either. I have some money saved up. I'd like to do some kind of work that is useful, that helps the weak. I wouldn't mind working the fields in a frontier village and acting as a pseudo-priest. What would your plan be, Hecarim? What would I do? The corners of Roberdick's mouth tweaked upward. Is it all right for you to decide that all on your own? It took a little while for Hecarim to see what Roberdick was getting at. Finally the implication sunk in, and his face twitched. What? It was a wicked laugh. Did you think we wouldn't notice? But it's not like we were trying to hide it. It just wasn't the right time, you know? So that's what you were talking about with the gift. Who made the first move? Hey, Roberdick. Look over there. Hecarim was pointing to a pair of people browsing items in a splendid tent. One was a warrior clad in raven-black armor. A crimson cape hung down the figure's back, draped over huge swords. Quite a contrived way to change the subject. Well, that's fine. I'll have you tell me all about it later. That is some impressive gear. If the person inside is worthy of it, they would be one skilled warrior. Maybe someone we know got new armor? I'm not positive, but I don't think it's anyone I've seen around the imperial capital before. And besides, see that woman standing there kind of hidden? She's a new face. I don't have a good angle. Who's more beautiful, her or Miss Imina? Don't go there, man. I can't be answering a question like that. But honestly, the lady standing over there is prettier. Miss Imina is quite a pretty lady. If you, head over heels in love, would say that, then. I see. They must be travelers or adventurers who ended up here. Or maybe they're going to start with a fresh base in the city. But they're shopping around the daily use magic items. Isn't that weird? There were all sorts of enchanted goods inside the splendid tent, but not the kind adventurers or workers would use, more just for everyday use. For example, one was a refrigerator, a box that could be filled with chill to protect items held inside. There was also a fan, which created a nice breeze. Most of these items had been thought up 200 years ago by the Minotaur, known as the Altok Sage. He was a warrior, and the nickname came from the fact that he proposed lots of items but didn't have the ability to make them, nor could he explain why they were shaped like they were or by what logic he'd arrived at them. Supposedly, he was a first-rate warrior, though, to the point where there were still fishy-sounding legends being told, saying he could whip up tornadoes with a swing of his axe and split the earth if he struck it. He was also known for mobilizing the large country of Minotaurs, who thought of humans only as food, to elevate the human race to the status of slave laborers. Adventurers usually lived in inns, so it was rare to see one interested in buying household items thought up by that subhuman. They were difficult to take on adventures. It's not so strange. The Empire's magic technology is fairly advanced. You can buy things cheaper than in other countries, so perhaps they estimate shopping is worth it even figuring in the effort of taking their purchases home. I see. That could be. Certainly, if you figured us as the standard customer, it'd be odd, but I don't think it's so weird for someone passing through. Yeah, that makes sense. When I think of it that way, I understand why they look so invested. The warrior in the armor was inspecting all the magic items very thoroughly, opening and closing the doors, holding things up, flipping them over. Hecarim thought he could see beads of sweat forming on the merchant's forehead. Maybe we should get that invested in our own search. Yeah. End of the first chapter. If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support.